I'm FREEDBERG, Executive Director of EdSource. Thank you for joining us. I really appreciate you joining this panel discussion, this town hall meeting. Across California, as all of you know, students are already starting school, but back to school looks very different this year. Most districts are resuming with distance learning, though a few have been planning to bring at least some students back in person. Our reporters have been covering school plans for reopening, and we convened this gathering today so you can hear your questions and answer them, so we can hear your questions and answer them as best we can, given that things continue to shift by the day. We've already received more than 200 excellent questions. Though we won't be able to answer all of them in this hour, we will be posting answers to your other questions in a back to school FAQ on our website. Your questions will also continue to inform our reporting in the coming weeks. And I also wanted to urge you all to join our community network so we can keep you informed about developments in California's education landscape, as well as reach out to you for your insights. We're going to start with earliest kids. We have Zadie Stavely, our early ed reporter, on the line. Welcome, Zadie.
Hi, Louis.
Todd from Oceanside said his district is planning to provide childcare at school sites for anyone in the K through 8 grades. Now, if that group is safe, why couldn't you have a teacher monitoring it and call it a regular class? Why is that permissible and not an in-school class? Zadie, could you explain?
Basically, there are two sets of rules. Childcare all over the state has been available for any children since about June 1st. And not all childcare centers are open, but many have opened, and many family childcare homes have opened as well. And the main reason why they're open, we know, is because they couldn't afford to stay closed. Childcare providers are really worried about being in person. They're worried about the health risks, but they really cannot afford to close. And so that is one reason why childcare is permissible right now. The other reason, and this is the main reason why childcare is probably being seen on school sites, is for two reasons. One is because school districts are trying to help parents who really need childcare, who have to go back to work, or who really need supervision while working from home, who don't have any help at all, perhaps single parents, etc. Some school districts are giving priority to those children who they consider vulnerable, or, for example, homeless children. On the other thing to consider is health risk, and so that's what Todd was asking. It's not totally clear whether it's actually safer to have childcare, but after speaking with epidemiologists and public health experts, childcare is offered in small groups, so up to 10, up to 15, depending how many. That would probably be similar to a school setting, but the difference is that childcare is most likely going to have fewer children and adults, fewer people overall at a school site. So not every classroom is going to be open, whereas if a school was open for a hybrid model, every classroom would be open, and there would be small groups in each classroom, but overall on the campus site, there would be more people, which would be more of a risk.
Zadie, I just wanted to ask you, are there things that the regular schools could learn from this experience with the early childcare classes that are open on school campuses?
Yeah, so just to be totally clear, when I'm saying childcare, it doesn't mean only early learning. It could be anywhere from kindergarten up to 8th grade. But there are some lessons. I mean, since childcare has been open, mostly early learning has been open since June, and in some cases, some centers have been open since earlier. There are definitely lessons. It's not totally clear yet if COVID is spreading in childcare settings, but there are definitely lessons around like how to help kids wear masks, and preschool teachers who have tried to make things fun in a certain way and try to work with kids to do social distancing. I'm not sure we're at a place where I could say there are a ton of lessons, but I do have an article about that too, and it's called something like there's a new lesson in California preschools, no sharing, if people want to check that out.
And do you have a sense of how many? I mean, is this happening at many schools, a small number of schools that are offering these childcare services on the campuses?
So childcare for school-age children, I don't have a sense of how common it is all over the state, but I do know that there are school districts all over the state that are offering childcare. Some of them are only offering, they're offering like free childcare, and they're only offering it to low-income students or students that they consider at high risk for learning loss. And other districts are offering it for anyone, and they're charging a fee.
Okay, so if somebody wants to know, parents want to know what's available on at the school site, go on the website, look and see what. Should it be pretty clear as to whether those services
I would suggest that they contact their district.
Okay, well, we're going to thank you, Zadie. We're going to now move to the other end of the spectrum. You know, we've been so much focused on distance learning, but you know, several campuses, particularly the University of California, are planning for students being physically on campus, at least some of them. Michael BURKE covers higher ed for us. Michael, could you tell us a little bit about what is happening in higher ed and what plans are being made for students and staff who are physically on campus, or they hope will be physically on campus?
So the vast majority of classes, college classes across the state, are going to be online, especially the traditional lecture courses, which are under the state's guidance that came out last week, are prohibited from being held in person at most colleges and universities. But some of the more specialized hands-on courses, like science labs, for example, those can be held in person, but there will obviously be physical distancing and other safety measures in place. And there are some colleges and universities, ones that are in counties where the virus isn't spreading as much, that under the guidance, they're allowed to actually have more classes in person, but even some of them, like Humboldt State, for example, a CSU, Cal State campus, even many of those types of campuses are still planning to hold most of their classes virtually. But even with most classes being online, the four-year universities generally, as you alluded to, between some classes being in person and then also housing, they're going to be housing, in some cases, thousands of students. So there will be plenty of students at a lot of these campuses that will physically be there. And as to whether, how to keep those students safe, the plans really vary from campus to campus, particularly in terms of testing and contact tracing. Some campuses, like a lot of the UCs, UCLA, UC San Diego, are going to be requiring COVID-19 testing, even of students and staff who are asymptomatic. But other campuses don't quite have the capacity to do that. So they're just asking their students to sort of self-monitor for symptoms and, stay home, isolate if they're symptomatic. So it really does vary a lot from campus to campus. So, if you're a student or a staff or faculty member at a campus, it's probably best to check with your individual campus, because it does vary a lot from one campus to the next.
Michael, I want to ask you a similar question for what I asked Zadie, a follow-up. I mean, if you have colleges in counties that are on the state monitoring list and they can bring students back, and you have schools that can't bring students back, why will it be viewed as safer to have kids or students on campus where it wouldn't work for K-12 students?
Well, a lot of students rely on the colleges for housing. A lot of low-income students, students who may be homeless, rely on campuses for housing. And I think that's a big reason why some of the campuses like UC Berkeley, which is starting 100% online, are still planning to offer housing. And then also just a lot of the courses, really can't be replicated virtually. Some of the career and technical education courses, science labs, as to whether it's safer, I don't know if it's exactly safe, but I think that's sort of the reason. And we have seen some campuses, as I mentioned, Berkeley, UC Merced, that were planning to have those types of courses in person, but even those classes now at those campuses aren't going to be in person. So we've seen universities backtrack as they've gotten closer to reopening, because Berkeley and Merced are the only two UC campuses that open, that start classes in August, because their semesters on the semester schedule. The rest are on the quarter schedule. So, it'll be interesting to see if many of these campuses that are planning to have at least some courses in person, if they'll actually follow through with that, because
but I think it's also the case that for many of the students who are on campus, they will be not taking any courses with others. They will all be remote courses, that they are in dorms, one person to a room, a lot of very strict social distancing and other health guidelines. And so the hope is that they will be able to control those, the dorm experience, the residential side of it. But that's an open question, right? Yeah,
of course. But as you say, it's going to be completely different. One student to a room in most cases. They're trying to limit bathroom usage to, not sharing bathrooms. Drinking fountains are prohibited. So many things that are just common areas that aren't essential are going to be closed. So yeah, dorm life is going to be completely different than you would see in a typical semester.
Yeah, and still, of course, we will be everybody is monitoring the situation very carefully over the next few weeks for those campuses that are planning to bring students back. And so those plans could change still by the time they open. Most of the UCs only open the end of September. So still a ways to go on that. Okay, thank you, Michael Burke, covering higher ed for EdSource.
Thanks, Louis.
So we did, one of the interesting things is that while most students, both in K-12 and at the higher ed on post-secondary level, are going to be learning via distance learning, there's some students will be going back to school, particularly in those states where, in those counties where that are not on the monitoring list. It's also a possibility of getting waivers at the K-6 grades. And there's still, based on your questions, there's still a lot of anxiety about face masks and what happens when students are in school. So I wanted to ask Diana Lambert, who has been tracking this very closely, when schools open for in-person classes and for those that will be opening or are open in the state, what procedures will be in place for if a student tests positive for the coronavirus? And we also have a question from Gretchen from Alameda, who's asking what kind of protective gear is recommended.
Thanks for the question. If a student or a teacher tests positive for coronavirus, they're immediately isolated in a separate room until they can be taken home. And then they have to notify, the school district has to notify all the staff and families of the students, as well as health officials, to let them know this has happened. And then that person cannot return back to the campus for 10 days. Then anyone who's had any proximity to that person is also quarantined, but they're quarantined for 14 days because they don't have symptoms yet. And then they have to disinfect the entire campus or any area specifically that person has been close to. That's basically the procedure when someone's ill. Now, the mask question or the equipment question is that people are asked to wear, or actually mandated to wear masks to school or face shields with the drape that can tuck into their shirt underneath, and then has straps or ties that go behind the ears.
I gather that there's, you've also been tracking this, Diana. How much resistance is there to the whole mask issue? It seemed like that issue should have been resolved, and governor every day is getting up and pleading with people. But I gather there's still a number of parents who don't really believe in that. But how widespread is that, do you think?
Well, the pushback in California isn't as bad as it is in other states, basically, but there still is. There's been school board meeting after school board meeting where parents are protesting either to not have masks on campus or to require masks on campus. This was before they were required. So there's a lot of pushback from parents who don't think either they don't think their kids will be able to breathe in the mask, or they think it will cause them to have some sort of emotional harm from wearing the masks or watching other people wear them. they're afraid that that would scare them. So there was a lot of pushback, or it is political in some cases too, where they just actually don't believe this virus is a real thing.
And are these for parents who the kids are going back to school, or this is just in the event that the kids go back to school?
Both cases, they were pushing back before the mandate to close schools. And in some cases, we still have schools reopening, or at least scheduled to reopen, and they're pushing back in those communities too. And I've heard from parents who say when schools reopen in communities that are closed right now, they don't want their kids to wear masks.
Wow, extraordinary. Well, thank you for that, Diana Lambert. We'll be circling back with you on some related questions. But I wanted to go to another question from Marianne from LA, who'd like to know if core academic subjects will be given more instructional minutes than electives. Sydney, could you tell us about the instructional time requirements and this balance between core academic subjects and instructional minutes?
Yeah, thanks, Louis. So earlier this summer, California passed a law that included adjustments to the amount of instructional time that students have to receive this school year during distance learning. So just briefly, what's required is 3 hours a day for kindergartners, 3 hours and 50 minutes for students who are in 1st through 3rd grade, and 4 hours for students who are in grades 4 and above. And instructional time is essentially calculated based on a mix of synchronous or asynchronous instruction. What that means essentially is live or not live instruction. So you can think of synchronous as what we're doing right now on the computer, talking live, someone on both sides. And you can think of asynchronous as kind of like homework, what that used to be. So essentially, students are assigned an amount of work and the teacher isn't necessarily on screen with them, but they'll later go back and work on it together. And so these instructional minutes can be any combination of synchronous or asynchronous. It can be check-ins, pre-recorded video, maybe using print materials that would take a certain amount of time, and then live lessons as well. Now to Miriam's question more specifically, there aren't set requirements in SB 98 specifically for certain subjects. Previously in a typical school year, there are minute requirements for PE, for an example, as an elective, but those were waived this year. What a lot of districts are doing, especially in the middle and high school level, is they're setting up block scheduling. So most students will still be getting all of their classes, and that includes electives, which would theoretically be getting the same amount of class time as they would have in a traditional school year. So if a student has 6 classes, they're still going to have all 6 of those classes. And districts actually have a lot of incentive to include electives right now. One thing that I've been hearing from some teachers and administrators is that a real big part of this challenge is going to be keeping students engaged, and subjects like PE, art, music, coding, some of these maybe non-core subjects really have a lot of potential to bring students back in and engage them in different ways. Now that all said, one place where I have seen some concern about this is at the elementary level. Since there are not specific requirements for how much time needs to be given for each subject, there have been some teachers and districts that have told me that they are being told to focus specifically on math and English language arts, and maybe subjects like science and social studies, which before the pandemic we already knew could be a struggle to fit in the curriculum, will not maybe have as much time. But that might be case by case, and I know that there's still lots of districts that are still trying to incorporate that as much, but realistically that might be one of those examples where there just aren't enough minutes in the day. I think it's also worth pointing out that California doesn't mandate a minimum number of live synchronous minutes right now, but it's been strongly suggested and supported by experts that that's going to be really important for students to maintain that engagement, whether it's an elective or not. Oh, sorry, Lewis. I think you're still muted.
Okay, host also has to unmute. You know, one of the interesting things the last few months is that there's a whole new vocabulary that's emerged. Some of these terms I know familiar to many of you listening, but not, you know, across the board, synchronous versus asynchronous. And that's something that everybody is, you know, seems to come up in every conversation. Synchronous being the direct communication between the parent, between the teacher and the student, and asynchronous being when the student is working on his or her own. I did just want to ask you quickly, Sydney, we talked with Sal Khan from the Khan Academy on our podcast, which I encourage all of you, if you haven't come across it, to check out this week in Northern California. John FENSTERWALD, my co-host, on the line here too. He said, you know, given that this is such a challenging period, we really should be focusing on the core subjects, math, English, science, and that doesn't mean say ignore the others, but really pay attention to that. But on the other hand, school districts are expected to grade those students and keep attendance on those other subjects. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on how they might manage that.
I think again for middle and high school, it's going to be a lot. I don't want to say easy because I don't think anything's going to be easy about this, but more manageable, just since block scheduling will allow those, you know, whether it's a core subject or not, those classes will still exist and be incorporated into a student's schedule. And most districts that I've spoken to are grading this year, and it won't change anything there. Grading is different in the elementary level. As we know, it's not usually just 6 different grades. Usually they're graded on a lot of different areas. So I think it's a little unclear how that will work if they are focusing more on these core subjects in elementary grades, how they will be grading some of these electives, or maybe, like I've heard a lot of schools doing things like Wellness Wednesdays. Are there going to be kind of graded elements to that? That's something that I'm still trying to figure out.
Okay, well, that's a really key core issue there. Now, another core issue on the teacher preparation side, you know, this is another huge issue. We're going to go back to Diana Lambert, who has been tracking the whole teaching issue. You know, I think one of the key parts of teacher preparation is that the 6 months or more, sometimes a year long, of student teaching in the classroom, what they call a clinical experience. How would teachers or would-be teachers do that when we don't have students in class? And how is the state responding to that? Where do we stand on that, Diana?
Yeah, well, the Commission on Teacher Credentialing decided a few months back that it was going to waive the 600 required student teaching hours and instead allow universities to decide when student teachers or when teacher candidates are prepared to go into the classroom. And what they're recommending is that teacher candidates do their student teaching online, or if that's not possible, that they do things like analyze video of other teachers teaching to look at best practices in lieu of those 600 hours. So that's basically what's changed with student teaching, but they've also waived, the state has waived many of the requirements for teacher credentialing. There's a whole list of them. I can list them in the Q&A because it's immense and some of them are repeat one another. But basically some of the testing they don't have to do till later. They've delayed the CBEST and the CSET, so they don't have to take them at the usual times, and they can delay that and get the preliminary credentials before and go ahead and go into teaching, but they have to get those tests before they get their complete full credential.
Diana, I just want to ask you, are people concerned that by waiving some of these requirements, I mean, the teacher preparation program would still have to certify that they feel the teacher is prepared, but they wouldn't have to do the whole 600 hours necessarily. Right. The teachers will be less prepared when they actually go into the classroom. Are there concerns about that?
There's been some concern, but not a lot, because all of this is temporary. It's just being done during the coronavirus because testing centers have been closed in some cases, so they waived the testing. the teacher, student teaching. There's not enough virtual student teaching for all the student teachers. So it's all very temporary. So there hasn't been too much pushback on it. If they try to make it permanent, I'm sure that will change.
And one thing I just wanted to share with all of you, been talking with some people in the teacher preparation field. I'm sure many of you, quite a few of you on this call, talking with Pia Wong at Sac State, for example. And one of the fortunate things is that the teacher enrollments in teacher preparation programs have actually held steady, and in some cases are going up. I think there's been some concern that maybe, threat of layoffs and so on, that people thinking about teaching might not sign up for these programs, but we've averted the threat of layoffs for the coming year. Is that correct, Diana?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, because the funding held steady. So yes, don't see a lot of layoffs coming in.
And because of the deferring the money that the state will owe districts down the road. But at least for now, teachers are protected from layoffs. So one of the consequences appears to be that we will still have people wanting to go into teaching, which is fantastic. Thanks, Diana. Going to just circle back with Carolyn now. Actually, first time. Hi, Carolyn. Carolyn Jones.
Hi, Louis.
Ileana from LA would like to know another one of these usually challenging issues in this distance learning era. How can schools provide speech and occupational therapy virtually?
Well, that has been the million-dollar question, literally, I think. I know that that's been the major concern and the big hurdle for districts everywhere, is how to provide these services that so many kids in special ed rely on: speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy. Some districts are setting up one-on-one Zoom calls, like a therapist meeting individually with one student. In some districts, therapists are actually going to students' homes, or the student might be going to the school to meet with a therapist one-on-one. Some districts have gotten waivers for that. It's not really recommended, I think, but that's happening despite the health risks. In some areas, they're trying to train parents on how to provide these services at home. So it's been, people are trying their best, but I don't think that there's any perfect solution.
Let me just ask you where we stand on the whole issue of the IEP, individual education plans. I mean, if this is specified in the IEP that this is in special ed, that you are required to, it's one of these services, appropriate services, speech and therapy, are schools expected or required to make good on what is in the IEP?
Yes.
That's a short answer.
Well, yes, it's at first there was a lot of ambiguity about that when this whole thing first started, but since then both the state and the federal government have come out, and said that yes, it's mandatory. All schools need to provide special education and live up to and hold true to their IEPs. And then most recently, the state of California required that all IEPs have to include now a distance learning plan, which would apply not just to pandemics like this, but to earthquakes, wildfires, anything that would close a school. So there's this mad rush right now to put distance learning plans into IEPs. It's just a question of what that's going to say and how it's going to get done and when it's going to go into effect. But that's happening all over the state right now. And to answer, yes, to reiterate, yes, schools do need to provide special education and live up to IEPs for all students.
Well, hugely challenging area. Just quickly, how do we address the potential for an even larger socioeconomic divide in access to special ed services? Is it going to be, the parents who really have the resources to demand it, maybe even threaten legal action, would be more likely to get those services? Yeah,
well, that's always, litigation is always an issue with special ed. There are a number of nonprofit and pro bono law firms in the state that take on these cases. I know districts are trying to get technology to all the kids, but it's not just laptop. I mean, for kids in special ed, it wouldn't just be laptops or tablets. It might be assistive devices that they use at school, you know, to help them speak, or, you know, even use a laptop. So getting those devices to the children's homes has been a big deal. There's been lots of efforts to kind of help, but it's just a huge challenge to try to reach all these kids.
Well, before I let you go, there's also, you know, another question that I see coming up quite a bit. I guess it's on the same level, is mental health counseling. This is not just for special ed kids. I mean, this is, I think, one of the things that's concerned about mental health that were brought on by the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, counselors.
So how do students identify students? How do districts identify students at risk, first of all? I mean, that seems very difficult when the kids are at home.
Yeah, well, that's a huge, yeah, I think mental health has been a huge concern, not just for students, but for staff too. So, I mean, there's the kids who were receiving services before all this happened. I mean, they're the obvious ones. Kids who are experiencing depression or anxiety or had problems at home, who are already receiving counseling at school. So there's them. But then they're trying to train teachers to sort of be on the lookout for kids who might be in distress. There's also this issue with so many families who might have been fine before the pandemic, but now there might be unemployment, or, you know, just much more stress in the household, or people who are sick or not working. So there's a lot of factors there that are contributing to stress for students. So schools are trying to, they're trying to hire more counselors. I think San Francisco Unified just hired 10 more psychologists. The districts who can afford it are hiring more mental health professionals, and the ones who can't are trying to partner with local nonprofits to provide mental health services. They're also trying to train teachers to kind of do what they can in addition to the 10 million things they also do. And then schools are also kind of setting up these wellness protocols. You know, it's not great, but it helps, I think, for a lot of families. They have these virtual calming rooms on their websites, you know, where they have like—
Sorry, what are those?
Virtual calming rooms.
Okay, what is
San Francisco, Sacramento City Unified has one of them. I think a lot of districts have them, where you can go and they have, you know, tips for mindfulness and yoga and meditation and exercise, and then also resources for families like, do you need food? Do you have everything you need? And then also, you know, counseling referrals. So there's a lot there. Districts are really trying hard to make that connection with students and their families.
So if I'm a parent and I have concerns, or a teacher for that matter, about how my kids are handling all of this, or issues that really come up that more acute than even before, what would they do in that regard?
Well, talk to the school counselors and have the school counselors reach out to the family and the student and, you know, talk to them individually. And, you know, sometimes it's just a question of, you know, the family's hungry and needs to find, be connected to a local food bank. Sometimes it's a problem that's easily solved, and sometimes it's a more long-term issue, but the counselors can really do a lot.
So, but you make a good point there. The counselors are still available, right? They may not
Yes.
be.
Yes, counselors, school psychologists, school social workers, yeah.
Okay, well, very usually important issue there. I just wanted to remind you, if you have questions, go to the Q&A button on the right-hand side. We're not using the chat feature, but on the Q&A function. We're going to try to get to as many of your questions as we can. I'm going to go to Ali, to Dayon. With this question, it's related. How can districts support emotional wellness and help students to engage with peers and maintain connections? Ali, can you tell us, what are you hearing from districts about this?
Thanks, Louis. Well, going off of what Carolyn was saying, a lot of districts are incorporating emotional wellness into their formal reopening plans, and are also accounting for this in their discussions with the local labor unions. So one district, for example, West Contra Costa Unified here in the East Bay, they're starting their semester out August 17th. And they are one of the districts that has designated Fridays as Wellness Fridays. And what that means is instead of a traditional school day where there's, lessons and assignments and stuff like that, teachers will use those days to reach out to families, build relationships. And there will also be time for students to meet with advisors and counselors for social emotional support. There's also time designated for social interaction between students, enrichment activities, and also, if they need to catch up with work from the week. San Francisco Unified is also, taking emotional wellness into their reopening plan. They're doing things like they're going to hold assessments, as they're assessing students on their skills in English, math, and other subjects. They're also going to assess students' social emotional well-being throughout the year. They've also partnered with the local news station to offer a 1-hour TV show that includes social emotional lessons for younger students who may not have access to technology the same as older students.
This is all in one district?
Yeah, San Francisco Unified.
And San Francisco Unified. Yeah, we'd love to hear from those of you who are watching, if you anything innovative that your district is doing or that you've heard about. We'd love to share those ideas across the state, because I think this is obviously something that so many parents and teachers and everyone is struggling with. Ali, before I let you go, one of the issues that was like a really big deal when this pandemic started was the whole issue of schools providing meals, and both for students and families. And several people have asked about that, and there's been relatively little reporting on what's happening. Now schools are back in session, so that issue is back on the table. Can you give us an update?
Yeah, so I mean, over the summer and since schools closed, a lot of people have been relying on schools, to provide food for their children. One of the big issues that's come up with the meal distribution is that the seamless summer option that districts have been relying on will be ending at the start of the fall semester. So that basically provided districts with a reimbursement from the USDA for meals that they distribute to children during this time. So what that means is a district can provide food for any child, regardless of whether they were a student at that district, regardless of their status, their financial status. Schools could be reimbursed for those meals they distributed. So that has only lasted through the summer and is set to end in the fall. So now in the fall, many districts are continuing offering those grab and go meals where you can pick it up from the school and eat it somewhere else. But they're only going to be reimbursed for the meals that are distributed to students who qualify for free and reduced priced meals. So students who don't qualify.
Is that going to be tough to really keep track of that, monitor that, and figure out?
Yeah, well, a lot of districts are saying that creates sort of a logistical nightmare because you have to check the eligibility of each student. So there is a bill that has been introduced to pretty much continue that seamless program in the fall, and districts such as Fresno Unified, West Contra Costa Unified, Santa Cruz City Schools, and Long Beach Unified, who I've talked to, are all very in favor of that going through. They said not only will it allow them to serve more families, but will also make the distribution process run a lot smoother and thus ensuring more social distancing.
Well, great. Well, we'd love to hear from you about how this is going to play itself out. This new requirement regulation seems seems like on top of everything that districts have to deal with to track who's picking up the meals or not is going to be very difficult. Thank you, Ali. We're now going to go to THERESA Harrington. THERESA is one of her assignments the last few months has been to attend Governor Newsom's briefings every day, at most days at noon from Sacramento. So I'd say THERESA knows more about the twists and turns and the minutia of state requirements than probably anybody on our staff, at least. THERESA, here's a question from Marissa, a student from Carlsbad. She says, and this is a big question, will we be able to get off the state's monitoring list and then be put back again?
I just wanted to explain what the state's monitoring list is, which is the state is looking at counties in terms of the number of COVID cases, the positivity rates, which means the number of cases out of the total tests that have been taken, if it's over a certain threshold, also the number of hospitalizations, ICU admissions, and the number of ventilators that they have available. And they have certain thresholds for each of these metrics. And when your county is over in any of these areas, then you get put on this monitoring list. And currently there are 38 counties in the state, which is over 95% of the entire student population on these lists. And the list has been frozen because of these data glitches that occurred. And they're trying to fix that in the next couple of days. But basically, you cannot open your school for in-person instruction unless your county has been off this list for 14 consecutive days. And there are elementary school waivers for students in grades kindergarten through 6 that you can request, but that's up to your local Department of Public Health in consultation with the State Department of Public Health. And those are on hold right now too, since the list has been frozen. So even if your county gets off the list for a couple of days, it can definitely get put back on because these metrics are updated on a daily basis. The other thing to keep in mind is that even if your county is off the list for 14 days, then there are other things that can still make you have to close down your classroom or your school or your district. So if you have a teacher or a student in your class test positive, the entire class has to go home and quarantine for 14 days. If you have 5% of your staff or students at your school test positive, the entire school has to close. And if 25% of the schools in your district are closed, the entire district has to close. So there are a lot of different things that can change, and this can fluctuate obviously on a daily basis. So most districts are saying that they assume that they will, even if they do reopen, they're assuming that they will probably have to send some kids or even entire schools or the whole district back into distance learning at some point during the school year.
THERESA, don't you think that school districts are going to be conservative? I mean, let's say your county gets off the list. I imagine they're not going to, like the next day, like, oh, let's get kids back into school, right? You'd be like, want to wait and see, is this a permanent thing, or, right?
Right, you have to wait 14 consecutive days. So you could be off the list for 13 days and then get back on, and then you have to start all over again, waiting for 14 consecutive days. And even then, most districts have sort of hybrid progressive approaches where they want to start start in-person learning for just certain groups of kids on certain days in smaller cohorts. So I don't think anyone's just going to suddenly reopen all their classes, the way they would have been last year.
So it would be a gradual thing, even if you get off the list, right?
Based on the plans that I've seen, yes, because they're still going to have all these other things in place, the physical distancing, smaller cohorts, and so you can't just reopen like it was last year.
Well, and certainly where we stand now, that there's not fewer counties getting on the list, it's been more counties getting on the list, although it's been holding steady now at about 38. But we'd love to see those numbers going down to 32, where they were when Governor Newsom first announced these guidelines, right?
Right, and as of today, he's still maintaining that the numbers are going down based on hospitalizations and ICU rates, which were not affected by the data glitch that happened. And so it does look like things are trending the correct way, which is downward, but that remains to be seen when they get the whole data glitch situation updated.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Theresa, and thank you for attending the governor's briefings. You know, I think when we started, it wasn't clear we'd still be doing this for 5 months, but here we are, and probably another 5 months. So, I want to go to John Fensterwald now. John, you also have been following these issues extremely closely, and a related question: what have you been hearing about the challenges of getting out of distance learning and actually getting back into the classroom?
Yeah, well, Theresa covered very well all the details about what the law requires, but I think districts don't want the ricochet effect of being open one day and then close the next. They really want predictability and consistency, and that's what parents want as well. So probably you'll be seeing maybe even as long as a semester or months before they return for the sake even that they won't have to close again. And you know, the other thing is that they have to plan for parents who won't want to go back. You can say school's open, but how many parents will not then send their students back? So that requires shuffling teachers around, deciding how many kids are going to be in a class. It's very, very complicated. So I think, as you said, they're going to be very conservative. The other thing is, you know, you have to have all these requirements to open. You have to have safety and health taken care of. And I think one of the biggest issues that hasn't been given too much attention is ventilation. Because there's a study that says half the schools in the Central Valley, for example, don't meet the fresh air requirement. If you don't have fresh air, you don't meet that, and you don't have the air conditioning and heating and the right filters, you're going to have problems. And so when the California Teachers Association says, well, you know, you need more funding to open, I think mainly they're talking about all the efforts and money that will be required to open a school. And then the final thing to add to that is that right now you don't need a waiver to bring back high priority students, foster kids, some special education kids. It's a negotiation issue, but under state guidance, you can bring back these high priority students. And it's a contentious issue, but there are districts that are doing it, particularly with people who are not teachers, bringing them back into libraries and gyms, and people who cannot get access, for example, to internet connections, and offering them space. And I think that's what you will see first.
John, just to clarify, so they can do that with these high needs kids, even now in the ones that are on the list?
Yes, I've been told that is actually it's happening. It will happen starting next week in Pajaro Valley because teachers aren't involved. Teachers will be teaching remotely, but there will be some, and I don't think Pajaro Valley is the only district.
Where is Pajaro Valley?
Near Watsonville, or it is Watsonville.
Yeah. And just to clarify, you had said that some of these schools don't meet the fresh air requirement. What do you mean by that?
In other words, you have to have certain, in order to be safe, you have to have certain circulation, you have to have filters to ensure that airborne particles are the big problem. You know, when we first started, we thought it was contact, all the efforts of cleaning, but it's really the aerosol particles that now recognize as a more significant danger. And I think ventilation in classrooms and air conditioning will be the focus.
Well, that issue has not gotten the attention it deserves, but certainly a key one. And it's, of course, we forget that for those of us living in the Bay Area, you know, I'd say this side of the coastal range where it's cool most of the time, that so much of California is extremely hot, and you have to have air conditioning. And so you can't just keep the windows open. And then of course, if the air is polluted, I mean, it's a complicated issue. Wanted to go to higher ed again, turning now to Larry Gordon, longtime higher ed reporter. Larry, welcome.
Thanks, Louis.
One of the questions that was raised is, what do high school juniors and seniors need to do to prepare for and apply to college? I mean, you could spend 15 minutes on that, but there's a lot of anxiety now.
I mean, the most basic thing is to not treat this school year as a vacation and to actually take it seriously, you know, because the online education, whether it's your grade or a pass-fail, it's going to count. And, you know, students have to get into that mindset that this is not, you know, a playtime, that, you know, this is actually class time. The other thing that's important, I think, is for them to really check, especially if they want to go to a UC or to a CSU, that they're taking the right classes, that they are fulfilling the A through G class requirements that are required for the university entrance, because a lot of them have not been in as close contact with their counselors as they might have been, and they may be getting off the track. So they haven't been in touch with that to double check, triple check they're taking the right classes. And if you're headed for community college, make sure at the minimum that you are taking the right classes to fulfill your high school graduation, both the state requirements and your district. One other thing that's really important, even though the SAT and the ACT have been waived as mandatory requirements at universities, most of them around in the public sector, many private schools are still requiring those. So if students have any thought of applying to private and independent colleges, they can't just blow off the idea of taking the standardized tests. There are some big questions surrounding the test. They are scheduled to be in person starting relatively soon and being offered through the fall with social distancing. But I still think that may be in flux, and that students should be, if they've registered for a certain date for the SAT or the ACT sitting, they need to keep checking that date because it may be postponed, it may be merged. And both organizations say they're going to be trying to develop some online version that's not been fully unveiled yet. And the other thing is, time just zips by. It seems like, to me, when you're online, like the weeks and the months seem to go faster for some real reason. And the deadlines are the same for UC applications, November 30th, and CSU, December 4th. So the students need to keep in mind that, yeah, they're online, but the deadlines are still real.
Well, lots of moving parts there, and lots of unknowns. I wanted to go to Ashley Smith, our higher ed reporter, waiting very patiently. Hi, Ashley. Just quickly, just before we go I wanted to ask you about housing on campus, but we haven't really talked about the community colleges. What is the situation basically with community colleges? Are they also, there's 115 of them, so it's really hard to kind of keep track of all of them, but what's happening with the community colleges this fall? And those affect 2 million students. I mean, that's the biggest group of students by far, the post-secondary side.
Yes, so many of the community colleges are going online as well, but they will have in-person classes in the same way that CSU and the UC will have in-person classes if they need to. But the classes that will be in person are those that are deemed essential. So think of like applied health courses where you need nursing graduates. If those classes need to happen, they will be in person. They don't have the housing concern. There's only a few community college dormitories around the state. And the students who stay in those dorms tend to be lower income. They have no other place to go. So it's slightly different when it comes to dealing with housing. Probably won't see too much widespread testing at the community colleges, COVID testing happening, but they are taking the same precautions, having hand sanitizer stations and trying to get the message out there that students should always be wearing face masks and be as careful and as socially distanced as possible.
Well, thank you. And staying on top of the community colleges is also a major challenge during this pandemic. Ashley, just a word on students being offered housing at campuses where where classes are mostly virtual. That is still going to be happening as far as you're concerned, as far as you're aware?
Yes, Michael mentioned this earlier, but most of the UC CSU campuses are planning to open housing, even if most of their classes are online. The state guidance we saw released last week basically recommended limiting housing to 1 room per student, which is what the campuses are doing if they can. However, they are giving priority to students who are housing insecure, who are former or currently in foster care, who are low income, international students if they can. So they're prioritizing because they do have to limit space. The students should as well be following the state guidelines and not gathering in large groups or in lounge areas or large gathering spaces of a dorm. But they do plan on opening to students.
And we'll see what happens in the next few weeks. We are running out of time. I wanted to squeeze in a couple more questions. Back to John Fensterwald. Melissa, who's a parent from El Dorado Hill, says she's concerned that in the middle of this difficult year, the budget shortfalls of the spring will catch up with schools. She notes that it would devastate California education for years to come if after their heroic effort, teachers lose their jobs. I mean, what's the lay of the land on that?
I think Melissa has a good cause to be concerned. We're getting through the current year with borrowing. We're borrowing a lot of money under something called deferrals, in which late payments to schools, that's getting us through instead of cutting. We're also counting about $7 billion in the Federal CARES Act. And we're hoping there will be more next year, but we don't know what will happen. And there's still going to be the impacts of a recession. So and this year, teachers were protected and hourly workers from being laid off. Going into next year, we're talking about 21, 22. I doubt that will happen. I doubt it can happen. And there may be a substantial deficit. And, there are some revenue ideas out there. One is we're going to vote on Proposition 15, which would tax business property, raise up to $6 to $12 billion for the state, 40% of that for schools, but that won't help us next year. It would be too soon. So yeah, I think we're in perhaps one of the hardest years in education we will face will be the next year.
The next year being not this school, 21, 22. Is that
exactly
what you're saying?
Yeah.
Next year from now.
Yeah, doesn't seem so far away, but yes, that 21, 22.
I think we're all just taking this a day at a time, John, so we'll worry about
some
that.
people are looking ahead, though.
You have to. Going to squeeze in one more question. Just wanted to remind you, please sign up for our community network so we can stay in touch with you and you can stay in touch with us and be a source for our reporting and keep us posted as to what's going on in your communities. And also let us know what kinds of issues you think we should be covering. So we started with Zadie, and we're going to end with Zadie. Zadie Maricela from Camarillo wants to know what strategies have been implemented to inform parents who don't speak English about support services and other issues.
So I don't know of a statewide strategy. I do know that several school districts have told me that what has worked best for them is partnering with parents to reach out to other parents. So a good example is some folks in Oxnard who told me that their parent engagement program through the California Association of Bilingual Education had parents that were already engaged. And then once they started doing distance learning, they just switched all of their training to distance learning training. And some of those parents who got the training started sharing with other parents. And one really nice example is a mom who noticed that a neighbor child was not getting onto the Zoom. So she went over, knocked on the parent's door, asked her why her son wasn't getting on the Zoom that her daughter was in. And the mom said, well, I can't make sure he gets on the Zoom because I have to work in the fields and I leave really early in the morning. And so this mom offered to help with breakfast and getting the child on Zoom. And it was just an example that they shared as an example of how parents have a real trust with other parents and have a power that districts can really use to engage and reach out to parents in a way that may not work if district officials or administrators are doing so.
Well, key issue.
And one other thing, we have a list of resources from several different organizations about reaching out to English learner families. And we'll be sharing that on our FAQ sheet.
And with that, we'll wrap it up. I want to thank you all for joining us and for all the great questions. I know that there are many that we could not get to, but we'll continue to add those answers to the FAQ page and also help us with our reporting. It suggests to us issues that we should be looking at more carefully. And for those of you who want to follow our reporting on California's most pressing issues, you can sign up for our daily email at edsource.org. And also for our weekly podcast. This week in California education, we'll be looking at the Central Valley this week for Friday's podcast. We also would like your feedback on this session. There'll be a very brief survey on the screen when we leave the webinar. So please take a minute to share your thoughts on today's discussion. With that, thank you for joining us. Stay well and look forward to our next town hall meeting.